I'm Joby Fisher, and this is a video that I've wanted to do for a while about the Rugby World Cup. Now, it only seems appropriate to do now 1 year out from the 2023 World Cup in France taking place next year. This is a little statistics based video. I like my stats. Short stats full of a little bit of emotion in there as well. We hold the Rugby World Cup quite dear to most rugby players' hearts, sportsmen's hearts, things like this where the world get together to celebrate like massive sporting achievement is something that we all appreciate. So we're gonna have a little deep dive into who do we think is the best overall World Cup team since the World Cup began its inaugural World Cup in 1987. We have a look at who's won the most tournaments. I've got a small tally of points. It's quite an interesting one. I've given out points for winning the World Cup, points for coming second, points for those that made it to the semi, points for and the third place, of course, points for those that made it into the pool. So just for attending the World Cup, you got some points. Now the results are relatively obvious. I think we all know who's going to come on top, but there's some questions that we need to answer about who deserves to be in second and what might have happened if it wasn't for relatively necessary political interventions into sport, which divides opinion as well. So firstly, let's have a little look at the table that I've made. You'll see here that, as I said, I've given out 1 point for making it to the World Cup, so being in the pool stage, 2 points for getting out of your pool, so into the quarter, 3 points for a semi-final, 4 points for a third place, 5 points for second, and 6 for winning the World Cup. And as I said, it's fairly obvious who's on top. It's New Zealand. They've won 3 World Cups, the inaugural in 1987, the 2011 World Cup in New Zealand, so at home, and then the 2015 World Cup in England. So that obviously puts them up on top. They've got 86 points, and they regularly finish up high in the standings. So when they don't win the World Cup, they've actually made it to one other World Cup final where they lost to South Africa in 1995, but they regularly make it to the World Cup semis. So they're always accumulating a lot of points. And the points do actually tally up as such. So if you get the 1 point for entering to making it to the pool, you take that 1 point. If you move out of the pool, you add 2 points in for the quarter, and then you add a further 3 points in for a semi, add a further 4, 5 or 6 points depending where you finish. So New Zealand, for example, winning the World Cup in 87, they got 12 points. Whereas France, coming second, got 11 points, and so on and so forth. So as expected, New Zealand are on top. They have 86 points with their 3 wins and regularly coming into the semi-finals, always accumulating high amount of points. They are way out ahead of the second team coming in with 71 points. That's Australia. They've got 2 wins, and again, they regularly finish in the semi-finals, only with a couple of quarter-final exits. So they're doing very well. Also coming second in both 2015 and 2003. So a lot of high finishes there for Australia. Then another slight drop down to the third in our table, which is actually France. Now, this might surprise some because they've never actually won a World Cup, but they have been to 3 World Cup finals. That is 87, 99 and 2011. So they've still managed to accumulate a lot of points, and they always regularly finish and make it to at least the semis, apart from in 2019, most recently, they were knocked out by Wales in the quarterfinals. So France finishing on 64 points, then followed by South Africa and England behind them. Now South Africa, this is the bogey team. This is the one that we need to ask questions about. if South Africa finishing so low and yet they've won 3 World Cups, why is this? Why have they not accumulated points? They did not compete at the 87 or the 91 World Cup, yet they are in that top tier of teams in terms of the tally points because they've won 3 World Cups still. They won their first World Cup they entered, 1995, they won 2007, and they won the most recent, 2019. So they've accumulated a lot of points, and also the other World Cups that they've entered, they have also made it to the semi. So they've always scored high points in terms of this table via finishing high in the World Cup, and they've never lost a World Cup final. That's something we're going to have to think about for later. So they didn't make it to 87. This is and 91 political reasons because of apartheid. They were shunned by World Rugby, and then finally invited in 1995, where they hosted the World Cup themselves and went on to win it. We're going to have a little look at what would have happened if they had gone to the World Cup in 87 and in 91. So the team that won it in 1991 was Australia. The team that won it in 1987 is New Zealand. We're going to have a look at specifically the New Zealand case. So would South Africa have beaten New Zealand around 1987? And we'll see here that New Zealand do have the upper hand over South Africa in terms of over the span of time that they have been competing against each other. New Zealand have won the majority of the games, roughly 60-40, maybe a little bit more, 65-35, and have maintained a level of dominance over South Africa. But, as I said, South Africa have managed to win the same amount of World Cups as New Zealand in a shorter time span. There's something about South Africa, they turn up for a World Cup. As I said, they've never lost a World Cup final that they've made it to. So this goes to say, in 1987, had they entered the World Cup, would they have put on a show? Would they have beaten New Zealand? They did, in fact, beat New Zealand once in the 80s for the 1987 World Cup. They only played them once in the 80s, or for one tour in the 80s in 1981. So that's a long time before 1987. But there was 3 games, they won one of them, and the other 2 games that they lost were still very close, but they lost them. So we're talking in knockout terms. If they had lost to New Zealand in the World Cup in 1987, doesn't matter how close it was, they would have been out, so be it. But they did win 1 game, which means that they were still close to New Zealand in terms of competitiveness, and they could have given them a good game and possibly could have won in 1987. Do we give them the benefit of the doubt? It's hard to say, but there's no doubt that they would have still finished high up in the World Cup, probably almost certainly making it to a quarter and a semi-final, possibly even to the final, where they may have faced New Zealand in the final, or France, who knows. 1991, the same with Australia. They would have almost undoubtedly made it to a quarter or a semi. We don't know whether they would have been placed in terms of pools and who they would have had to face in the quarter or the semi. Maybe they would have come up against Australia, who were undoubtedly the best team in the world at that time. So, would South Africa be higher in my table than New Zealand if they had competed at 1987 and 1991? We just can't say. We really just can't say. They are a bit of a bogey team. Something that we're going to have a little look at as well. Every single team that has won a World Cup until the most recent 2019 have gone through the entire tournament unbeaten. New Zealand, Australia, England 2003, also South Africa themselves in 1995 and in 2007. Until 2019, they managed to win the World Cup, having lost the game in their pool to New Zealand. So as we go further down the list, we're going to have a little look at the other teams, a few honourable mentions. Obviously we mentioned France, that's certainly an honourable mention to have finished so high up the table without actually winning a World Cup. We also have the likes of Samoa, that have been to a fair few World Cups. Canada, the big one, regularly making it to the World Cup. They finish on 11 points. Also the likes of Fiji and Japan that have accumulated points by regularly making it to a World Cup. Now, these points may be low, and there's a few teams that are only on 1 or 3 or like very few single-digit points because they only ever make it to the pool stages. Now, let's not undercut the achievement of making it to the pool stages. There are a lot of teams in world rugby that have never been to the World Cup, and yet they play good rugby. There's still a high standard. You've got the likes of Portugal that have only got 1 point, and now it's a very appropriate time to make this video and mention that Portugal have just made it and qualified for the 2023 World Cup, giving them now a total of 2 points as the World Cup approaches, because they've only been to the World Cup once in 2007, a massive achievement for Portugal. So let's not take anything away from those that have got lower amount of points, single-digit points. That's still a massive achievement for them to even make it to the World Cup. The likes of Zimbabwe, Romania only have a few points as well, and a few others on there. And we look back up into kind of middle table. We've got the likes of Argentina, who have actually got more points than both Scotland and Ireland, who you might say are more consistently higher ranked than Argentina. But Argentina have had the highest place finish of those teams, finishing 3rd, whereas we sadly know that Ireland regularly get knocked out in the quarterfinals, never making it past the quarterfinal, but always getting out of their pool stage. They have the dreaded quarterfinal curse. But Scotland, again, another team that are in the mix with the likes of Argentina in terms of Rugby World ranking. Another team to round out our mid-table, so finished just above those other teams, is Wales. Have had more semi-final placements than the other teams I've just mentioned. So again, they've not made it to a World Cup final. They've got half the amount of points than those heading the top of the list. But again, very noteworthy. They actually tend to out-achieve themselves in terms of World Cup finishes compared to their World Rugby rankings, which at the moment, for instance, they are in 8th or 9th on the Rugby World ranking, but we probably expect them to make it to a semi, hopefully, in 2023. Now we're going to have a look at some of the stats that I mentioned that I wanted to go into, a little bit of fun, starting off with some of the kicking stats. So we're looking at total points scored in terms of penalties, conversions and drop goals. Now I'm very happy to say that the leader of most of these kicking stats is Johnny Wilkinson, an Englishman, and he's done this from 1999, 2003, 2007, 2011. Now I say that the total points scored is included in the kicking stats, and that's because no one makes it to the top of the point scoring tally without being a kicker. Now you can score many tries, but those points aren't going to tally up how many points are kicked during a World Cup. So Johnny Wilkinson is right up the top there with over 270, a fair few ahead of his next closest competitor. After that, we also have him at the top of the penalty tally count. Again, way ahead of his competitor, and the drop goal count. So he scored 14 drop goals at World Cups, more than double the number 2 in the tally. The person who is in the lead, who takes number 1 spot in terms of conversions, is actually Dan Carter, New Zealand's Dan Carter. Again, he's quite far ahead of his number 2 spot behind him. Johnny Wilkinson down in 5th. Dan Carter, in terms of total points scored, is down in 5th. Johnny Wilkinson on top. Quite an interesting stat there. Johnny Wilkinson obviously has been to multiple World Cups. He's actually been to 2 World Cup finals, so he's had plenty of opportunity to kick lots of goals and score lots of conversions. But what might be noted about England during those World Cups where Johnny Wilkinson was there, he managed to score a lot, as we've seen, in drop goals, and he's an exceptional penalty kicker, which means that many of the points scored by England during their World Cup win in 2003 and their World Cup final attendance in 2007, they made it there, arguably, because of the likes of Johnny Wilkinson's incredible boot. Not to take away from the rest of the team, it was obviously a team effort to win the World Cup and make it to a final and perform superbly. But without the likes of Johnny Wilkinson there, maybe those points would not have been scored, and those games, especially the ones in tight margins, may not have been won. For example, 2003, beating the Australians in their own backyard, going to extra time, and it came down to, as we all know, a dropped goal. That was not novel for 2003. In 1995, the same thing happened. Extra time, South Africa against New Zealand, it came down to a drop goal to win it during extra time. Some more stats for you. So we've got the top try scorer. We actually have two people tied for the top spot. That is the wonderful, great and powerful and sadly missed Jonah Lomu, who had 15 tries in 2 World Cup appearances in 1995, where he burst onto the world stage. Everybody remembers some of the incredible tries that he scored, in particular against England in that semi-final. Also, Brian Habana, incredibly fast. So he in 2007, when winning the World Cup, scored multiple tries. Again, in 2011, he scored many tries. In 2015, he scored many tries. Possibly the reason we don't hold him quite as such a pedestal as Jonah Lomu is that he didn't score as many tries in a single World Cup as Jonah Lomu did. Again, he made 15 in only 2 World Cups, whereas Brian Habana had done it in 3. But both incredible feats to score so many tries at the highest elite level of rugby. Okay, so we have a little bit of a turn up for the books here in that we're going to have a look at the runs. Heading up the top of our runs stats is Richie McCaw. Now, that might not be too surprising to some, considering he's been to so many World Cups and he's been to so many finals during those World Cups. But again, it is a little bit of a surprise given that he is a back row player. Some might have thought that the most amount of runs might have been by a back like number 10 or a centre. Something less surprising is that Richie McCaw also tops the tally when it comes to most tackles. Now, this is something that Richie McCaw is most certainly known for, being one of the best players to ever play the game. And that's not necessarily because he's an all-round player. We know that Richie McCaw, for instance, isn't a back, he's not a kicker, he's fast, but he's not as fast as some of the backs. But at his position, at playing open side flanker in particular, he is so excellent at making tackles, at getting over the ball, as we've seen, carrying the ball, getting over the game line. That is something that Richie McCaw does better than anyone else in the game ever. And for that reason, many people hold him at the absolute peak of what it means to be a rugby player. Now, we also have a few other stats. So clean line breaks held by David Campese, who is a player who has of course won the World Cup with Australia. Incredible player, also always known for his line breaks, and obviously for good reason, because he makes so many of them at a World Cup where it is the highest, most elite level of rugby that we know, even during the pre-professional era, 1987, 1991 for instance. Okay, so a quick look at the team stats, and no surprise here, New Zealand at the top on numerous tallies. We've got most amount of matches played, which makes sense. We've got the most amount of points scored, the most amount of conversions, the most amount of tries, the most amount of run meters. And of course, again, this makes sense because New Zealand are at the top of my tally, which puts them, and not just at the top, but way ahead at the top. And it makes sense, they've played more minutes than anyone else at a World Cup. And for good reason, because they've won so many games. And even the World Cups, they didn't win the actual World Cup itself, they've also made it to the semi-final and then on to win a 3rd place as well. They've won multiple 3rd places when they haven't won the World Cups. So no doubt there that New Zealand obviously proving why they deserve to be at the top of the World Cup tally table. And the reason that we will probably say they are the best Rugby World Cup side. In close second, we've obviously got the likes of Australia and England following up close behind as well for multiple of these tallies. One of the reasons we could say that they do so well in these tallies is because they have made it to so many World Cups and they play so well during these World Cups. But something that we can't take away from New Zealand is the fact that the kind of rugby they play at the World Cup, it's not just the amount of games that they play, but how they conduct themselves within those games. New Zealand score tries. We cannot take that away from them. They run the ball very, very well. Obviously, they also kick a lot of points. They've got the likes of Dan Carter, who, as we know, has to kick those conversions. So there's another reason that the likes of Dan Carter is at the top of the conversions kicking list. Not just because New Zealand score a lot of tries, so he has a lot of conversions to take, but the fact that he is actually kicking those conversions, he has a high kick rate percentage in the 90 percentile. The only matched by the likes of Johnny Wilkinson, and we'll see here that England have scored way more drop goals than any other team in a World Cup. And that's not to say that other teams don't take drop goals. As I mentioned, South Africa have scored plenty of drop goals. Dan Carter himself scored a drop goal in the 2015 World Cup final. But for that period that Johnny Wilkinson was playing with England, he scored so many points that way, and so many penalties, putting England as a team at the top of that tally. And that's not, again, to take away from the likes of Rob Andrew. We've also had Toby Flood, Johnny Wilkinson scoring many penalties, but Johnny Wilkinson's boot really was outstanding. One thing that doesn't really hold too much light onto who is the best team at a World Cup is the likes of yellow and red cards. Now we can see here that there have been not too many red cards by individual players or teams over the years, which is obviously excellent news. Plenty of yellow cards, more so in recent years as the laws have become a little bit more stringent, a little bit more taxing on those that make high tackles, for instance. And I think that we're also going to see an increase still going forward at World Cups for red cards for the likes of high tackles, as we're trying to bring those high tackles down and bring the safety of players up. But it doesn't seem to be something that really influences how well a team does. So we'll see here that New Zealand have occurred many yellow cards throughout their time appearing in the World Cup. This could just be because of the amount of games that they have played, that means that they are going to be involved in more collisions and more yellow cards are going to be occurred. But the team that is at the top, Fiji, although they've always made it to the World Cup, they haven't necessarily made it very far, made it past the quarterfinals, certainly haven't made it to a final or a semi. So why have they occurred so many yellow cards? Could be their discipline, of course, most likely. Does that mean that their discipline affects their game? Is that why they're not reaching it further along to the World Cup stages, into the semi-final, into the finals? Maybe, maybe not. As we said, New Zealand have also managed to occur the same amount of yellow cards without it affecting the result of their games and eventually winning the World Cup. So, at the end of all of this, what can we say? Well, I think it is quite obvious that New Zealand are the best World Cup team to have existed since the beginning of the World Cup in 1987. They proved it purely via the points. Now, their points tallies are something incredible. They really are head and shoulders above the rest of international teams that compete at World Cups. And it is no doubt that they are going to win the most amount of World Cups if they're making twice as many runs, scoring twice as many tries as the next best team. They've played the most amount of games because they've made it to the most amount of finals. They really do seem to dominate the World Cup. But let's not forget South Africa. They are close behind. They have been outstanding at the World Cups that they have been to, but they have been to 2 less World Cups. That could be the difference between 20 points in my tally, which would actually put them at the top of my tally. If, for instance, South Africa had made it to the semi-final in 1987 and 1991, even not to win the World Cup, but to come in 3rd place, that would give them 20 points and put them ahead of New Zealand. Even with New Zealand winning in 1987, that would put them ahead. Australia winning in 1991, maybe South Africa would have made it to that final instead of England. Maybe they would have taken 2nd place, still not have won that World Cup, but they would have scored more points and been ahead of New Zealand in the points tally, making them the best World Cup team. Now we can't know, as we said, they might have been knocked out in the semi-finals by New Zealand. They might have been knocked out in the quarterfinals by Australia. We really don't know. They were those teams that won the World Cup, and they were dominating teams at that time period in world rugby outside of World Cups. Again, we can't know, but it's something that's interesting to ponder over, something that's interesting to have a deep dive and look into. Could South Africa, going forward in 2023, in 2027, in 2031, when the number of World Cups they've played is much closer to New Zealand's, they're always going to be two behind because they missed two. And if something was to happen to the likes of New Zealand and Australia and England and so on in future World Cups, for some reason disastrously they don't qualify, they're somehow ranked further than number 8, 10, 16, who knows, and they have to qualify and don't qualify, or perhaps a political scandal like what befell South Africa and the reason they were not invited to the World Cup at all. Perhaps that will draw them back level in the years to come, in the decades to come. We don't know until then. Until then, we can only speculate. But for now, I think it's fairly conclusive that New Zealand are the best rugby team in world rugby.